Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. As the culture war consumes American politics during this election cycle, the economy remains in a precarious state. Millions of people live on the margins. The only constant for them is insecurity. Economists debate an eventual recovery. They speak of a U, a V, and an L. But is the reality a K recovery, a permanent underclass? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my guest, Richard Wolff in New York. He is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, as well as author of the recent books, Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism. And in Westport, we cross to Peter Schiff. He is Chief Global Strategist at Euro-Pacific Asset Management. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's go to New York. Richard, in looking at the news about the economy, looking at a lot of macro numbers, sometimes I think it's quite confusing on where the economy is going, particularly when we look at unemployment, permanent unemployment, and jobs that are permanently lost here. But the more I look at it, and you two gentlemen are preeminent experts here, I don't really think it's a U, V, or an L. I'm really quite taken with this K recovery. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Is that an oversimplification, Richard? Go ahead.
Not at all. I think we've already seen that now for quite some time, at least 2, more 3 or 4 decades of growing inequality, both of wealth and income. And instead of that being understood as having contributed to the combination pandemic and crash we're living through, instead of that being understood, we see the crash having made it worse. The growth of the wealthy at the very top having outstripped everything we could have imagined, at the same time that now over 60 million Americans have had to file for one or another kind of state or federal unemployment compensation assistance. This is a system that is spinning out of control in terms of extremes of wealth inequality and income inequality, and there's nothing on the horizon that suggests that that's going to change. And so I think that is becoming a permanent quality of this economy. And in a society that used to, in the 20th century, pretend that it was a vast middle class, that capitalism was a tide that lifted all boats, I don't think this is politically or ideologically sustainable.
Peter, the same question to you, because if we look at the consumption patterns of the top 10%, during the worst of the pandemic, the lockdown, their consumption went down something like 15%, but the class that serves them, their income went down more than 30%. That's according to some reports here. So, I mean, and we do know the Jeff Bezos stories and the billionaire stories, how they've really done well out of all of this here. Is that akin to a K recovery? Because we do have this growing and maybe permanent underclass. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, you know, I don't even care what letter you want to try to use to describe it. My problem is with the word recovery, because I don't think we've recovered at all. Sure, there has been a recovery in the stock market in that the market recovered what it lost in the early days of COVID. And yes, I mean, this recession that we're currently in began with a very substantial collapse. And yes, there's been a bit of a bounce off of that collapse, but we're still in recession. And so I don't know if recovering to being in a less severe recession than we were in at one point really qualifies as a recovery. And I don't think we've seen the lows. I think we're going to relapse. I think we're actually going to go down. And there's a good chance that the stock market might make new lows as well. But regardless of what happens with that bubble in the short run, the reality is that Main Street's pain has actually been Wall Street's gain. It's precisely because the economy remains so weak. And what's really at the root cause of the weakness is not capitalism. It's the failure to have capitalism. It's the Federal Reserve that is monetizing massive government debts that are only inflating asset bubbles, but at the same time, it is depriving the real economy of the resources that it actually needs to grow and build a real recovery that would in fact lift all boats. Instead, we're settling for a fake recovery because that's the easiest one to create. Because in order to have a real recovery, we're going to have some short-term pain in order to make that possible. Because what has to recover is not consumption, but production. We need more savings, we need more capital investment. And to enable that, we actually need higher interest rates, not lower interest rates. And we need a smaller government, not a larger government. So everything that we have done since the pandemic began is actually weakening the economy. And we're compounding all of the mistakes that we made before the pandemic. If you remember, we were already slipping long before anybody heard of COVID-19. In the fourth quarter of 2018, that's when the wheels started coming off the bus. That's when the Fed did the about face and started cutting rates. That's when they really started to move from quantitative tightening back to quantitative easing. Now, in March of 2020, right, those trends accelerated. We went right back to zero, and we skipped QE4 and went right to QE infinity. But all these policies are simply blowing more air into a big bubble, and at the same time, they're depriving the real economy of the air that it needs to grow.
Yeah, but if I go back to, but all of these mistakes, and I essentially agree with much of what Peter said, but much of those mistakes have benefited the same people, the richest people that we've ever known in the history of humanity. Those mistakes, okay?
Yes, I agree.
No.
What a lot of assets.
We're agreeing, but I'm focusing on Richard here, is that, but because these mistakes have benefited these people, why should they do anything about it? I mean, they made out. I mean, there's no incentive here. Let me go to Richard here. There's no incentive to correct these mistakes. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I think the use of the word mistakes here always amazes me. It's a mistake over and over again, year after year. Peter's quite right, I agree. But these mistakes being systematic, being repeated over and over again, are not dealt with adequately by suggesting that if only the mistakes weren't made, we would have some nice functioning capitalism that would again lift all boats. It seems to me that the people at the top have figured out that if and when they can make more money. If that drowns the economy in a downturn, they can turn that to their advantage as well, using monetary policy to inflate the stocks upon which the bulk of their wealth depends. This is a mistake that's so often repeated that the word mistake starts to lose its meaning. This is the way capitalism flares out. It might be nice to imagine that it would function some other way, but that's a utopian imagery of a stateless capitalism that probably never existed, but in the last 100 years for sure has disappeared as the state has become a major lever for the growth and concentration of wealth, with or without the mergers between the state and the biggest capitalists, which is happening more and more as we see. I think this is the real capitalism we have to live with, and not the imaginary one that Peter likes to suggest.
No. See,
I'm in the middle. I'm in the middle of the both between the big. And when you said you agree with Peter, I think you're agreeing with both Peters here. Let me go to the other Peter here.
Yes.
Okay, you used the word capitalism. I think I think it's very problematic because it doesn't seem to be benefiting a whole lot of people these days. Nonetheless, here, I would agree with Peter, our guest here, in the sense that I'm tired of socialism for the very, very rich, and then everybody else gets the crumb in the capitalist economy. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, well, first of all, don't confuse what America has now with capitalism. I mean, what's left of capitalism have been destroyed by socialism. So it's the socialism that has crept into the system that is responsible for the problems in this mass disparity in wealth. But also, you assume that this is going to end well for the rich. I assure you it's not. These asset bubbles are temporary. A lot of this wealth only exists on paper. People are not actually spending that money. It just on a brokerage account statement. What is coming is a major collapse in the value of the dollar. The inflation is ultimately going to result in the cost of living rising much faster than the paper value of people's assets. So believe me, the rich are going to get theirs too. Everybody in America is going to be impoverished to a degree by these failed policies. It's not just the poor and the middle class. They're just going to suffer the most. But in the end, the rich are going to suffer too. The real solution for everybody is a return to capitalism. What we need is sound money, an independent Fed that no longer artificially manipulates interest rates to prop up asset prices and to subsidize government deficit spending. We need much higher interest rates. That will result in a big decline in spending from government, and consumers will have more savings, will have more capital investment. We need a lot less regulation as well as cuts to government spending so we can have a more vibrant economy instead of the sick economy we have now that is on life support, that is temporarily benefiting people who own the assets that benefit from the inflation that the Fed is creating. But ultimately, that inflation is going to rise, result in an increase in the cost of living for everybody. And we are headed for a dollar crisis. And clearly, the rich own more dollars than anybody else. And they have the most to lose when the value of the dollars they're holding completely implodes.
Okay, I think we have one thing all three of us have in common. A crisis is on the horizon here. But Richard, how can you save money? How can you invest money if you don't have a job? I mean, it's very simple here. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I'm amazed a little bit by this. We're going to have high interest rates. We're going to really crunch down on the economy. You mentioned in passing that the consumers will have to save more. They don't have anything left to save from. That's why the level of savings of the great mass of Americans is virtually zero or negative. Already, they've been suffering for so long, there's nothing left. To crunch down on them, which is already happening now, is a recipe for much more turmoil and chaos in this society than we're already seeing. I agree with Peter that this is going to end very badly, and it's going to deflate the bubble at the stock market alongside of everything else. But for me, this is the end of an empire. For the first time in my adult life, I don't see a way out. I don't see a solution emerging. I used to admire the way capitalism overcame the Great Depression and all the other afflictions that it has imposed on the people around it. But I don't
Capitalism
see one
didn't
now.
impose those inflictions. Government did.
No,
Capitalism got us out of it.
Wait a minute. It struck me as one remarkable thing, Peter, to blame socialism for the ills of capitalism is an extraordinary move at a time like this, when the socialist movement is coming back from a period of historic weakness, precisely at the time that the growth of inequality went rampant, as you yourself
Socialism
said.
has been alive and well beneath the
finish.
surface, undermining the structure of the American economy. Look, you're talking about the fact
that socialism.
All right, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a hard break, and after that hard break, we'll continue our discussion on whether this is a K recovery state with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing whether there'll be a K recovery. Okay, Richard, let me go back to you in New York. A few years ago, I met an Indian businessman, very successful Indian businessman. And at the time, India's economy was doing quite well. Again, usually using these macroeconomic indicators. Okay, GDP growth, income, number of people of employed. But at the same time, there's like 200 million people that live in stark poverty in India. And I said to him, I said, is your Indian model just to accept that you're going to have 200 million people in stark poverty? Because your economy is growing as an investment target. People are pouring money into it. I mean, is has the Indian economy just accepted it's going to have an underclass. So I'm asking you, is this what's happening to America, where we're going to have an underclass, permanent underclass, and it will, the perception is that there'll be enough political stability to maintain the status quo? Because it seems to me, I agree with the last remarks you made in the first part of the program, is that, I don't see a way out here. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. I think we're learning in a variety of ways to live with an enormous underclass. I might disagree with you that we didn't already have one. I think we did, but I think we are now learning to live with a much larger one. And you can see that in a variety of ways. The acceptance, despite what people claim, of 200,000 people dead from a pandemic that didn't have anything like that impact in many, many other countries. The United States has 4.5% of the world's people. It has 25% of the COVID cases and 25% of the deaths. For a rich country, that's a stupefying failure of management, but it's also the acceptance of unspeakable suffering in its population as if it were normal. And ditto for the level of poverty, ditto for the level of discrimination. Dr. Anthony Fauci yesterday at the Bloomberg Equality Summit explained how people of color in America have the lowest wealth, the lowest income, the highest cases of COVID, and they're the frontline workers. They're the ones that are suffering from hypertension, diabetes, obesity. If you wanted a proof of everything the Black Lives Matter movement wanted to suggest about systemic racism, you could just listen to Dr. Fauci for 15 minutes and you'd get it. And it is being accepted mainly by the government right now as official policy, since they're doing absolutely nothing to undercut it. I think we are becoming the society we used to see overseas. Enclaves of wealth, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and all of that, and surrounded by a sea of really desperate poverty. They have accepted that in India, and they have for 50 years, if not more, despite being independent from Great Britain. They have accepted it in Brazil, another case. And boy, you look at Trump, Bolsonaro, and Modi, and you can see the kind of right-wing government for which this is an acceptable arrangement.
Peter, and obviously I follow politics very carefully, and I watch snippets of the Republican and Democratic conventions, and I was appalled, absolutely appalled, that neither party had a proactive economic agenda to pursue in light of the high unemployment and the structural changes that are going through the economy. I didn't see that from either party here. And it goes back to my question to Richard, is this an acceptance that we're just going to have a whole lot more poor people?
Well, I disagree that we've even been having a growing economy. I don't think we had any growth even before COVID. I think the GDP numbers were manufactured based on understating the true rate of inflation. And so by understating inflation, you can make it appear that a stagnating or shrinking economy is actually growing. It's not. The reason that Americans don't have any savings is because the economy hasn't been growing. They've been able to keep it together through debt. They've used debt to replace their income. But why is that? It's because we don't have a vibrant economy, because we don't have real increases in productivity, thanks to big government and thanks to the Federal Reserve. So we're in this gigantic hole because we abandoned capitalism and embraced a socialist form of government. We have government central planning. We have central planning on interest rates. We have price fixing and market manipulation. And we have an economy where we're trying to generate growth by printing money and giving it to people to spend. And that is not going to work. As I said, the only way to get real economic growth is to shrink government so that we can have a stronger, more vibrant economy, because we need more productivity. To consume more, we have to produce more. And the government doesn't produce anything. All it does is interfere with the productive efforts of the private sector. You know, the
No,
problem is, though.
But Peter, but the government, particularly in the last few years, particularly during this economic turndown, they chose winners. I mean, you know, so Jeff Bezos and Apple and all they're the real socialists in America because they're the winners in all of this. Okay, I mean, I think, you know, these terms capitalist and socialist and all don't really mean anything. For me, is it who's benefiting from all of this? The middle class is not, the working classes, and the big tech companies are. And the banks are doing really well here.
No, the banks are not doing well. Look at the banks are imploding. Look at their share prices. Look, the banking sector is in a lot of trouble. But look, none of the bailouts should have happened. There shouldn't have been a PPP. The whole thing was a disaster. Nobody should be getting a check from the government. These extended unemployment benefits were a mistake. What we need is less government, not more government. Government has to cut spending, not increase it. Money printing is just going to make it worse. It's going to destroy the value of our money. And we're going to blame all these problems on capitalism, and we're going to continue to build a bigger and bigger government that is going to suffocate the life out of this economy. And the people who are going to suffer the most are going to be the middle class and the poor.
Okay, well, you know, the thing is that if you have, but I agree with you how the dollar is being destroyed here, but the people that are benefiting from this, they turn their dollars into real assets like land, which will always have value here. But what about working people that lost their job?
No, they're getting screwed.
They can't turn that into an asset.
Peter,
but what is the government supposed to do about it? The government can't solve that problem by printing money.
I've always found it extraordinary.
Go ahead, Richard.
I've always found it extraordinary that the way folks like Peter try to exonerate the capitalist system from its grotesque failures is by having a deus ex machina. The government drops into this story so that all the anger and bitterness and rage against the capitalism that produces all these problems, including owning and controlling the government, is exempted from the criticism. You siphon it all off on the government, create this utopian fantasy of a capitalism without, let me finish, without a capitalism without a government has never existed.
I didn't say no government.
Always existed.
Government.
The government has always been controlled by the people who have the big bucks. They've used it for their own advantage. The imagination that we could have a capitalism with a minority of employers that control everything, who are not going to try to control the government, is a fantasy we have never seen.
Your ignorance of the current situation is only exceeded by your ignorance of history.
Listen, I don't do that to you, so do me.
But I'm telling you, you're wrong. You don't understand capitalism. You have no idea what's going on in the U.S. economy.
Maybe
you believe in a bunch of nonsense.
Everybody what to do. Keeping on talking doesn't solve the problem. I go, then you go.
What's your solution to the problem?
You're not directing this conversation,
Well,
sir.
I'm asking you a question.
You're part of it. Yeah, that's not
What's your
function.
solution?
We have someone
government, more money printing. What's that going to do?
Listen, you're not.
We're just chewing up time. We're just chewing up time doing this here.
Yes.
Okay, Peter asked a fair question. What is the solution, Richard? Because we only have about 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Here we go. Capitalism is a system that is organized in every enterprise by having a small minority of people, the owner, the shareholder, the major shareholders, the board of directors, making all the decisions for the majority of people who are called employees. That's a very similar arrangement to the lords and the serfs of feudalism and to the masters and the slaves of slavery. We didn't break out of that dichotomy of a few controlling the many until we developed the concept of democracy. The solution to the problems of capitalism is to put capitalism where we put slavery and feudalism. We have to substitute a democratically organized enterprise right at the base. Every factory, every store, every office, organized in the way we organize our politics. One person, one vote. We decide together what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the fruits of the labor we've all contributed.
The problem is your solution
more
is
of a
worse
system
than the problem. You're talking about creating a Fidel Castro-like environment in the United States. Look, if you think this worked so well in Cuba, in the Soviet Union, in North Korea, you have this fantasy where communism works. It doesn't work. It only works in your imagination. It doesn't work in reality. Okay, and your ideology is responsible for misery, poverty, and death.
I want to ask a substantial question here. Peter, how would you react to tens of millions of people that have lost their job, have no future? And I don't think they think in terms of capitalism, but a lot of them would say, what is capitalism doing for me? And I think that's a legitimate question. Because I agree with your first answer in this program, because a recovery, it depends on yourself, where you are in life, if that's a recovery or not.
Yeah, the solution depends on embracing capitalism and rejecting socialism. We need to restore free market capitalism to this country. The government needs to get out of the way. We need to have sound money and limited government again. That is the only path back to prosperity. There is real pain. There are real problems. I don't deny that. Government and central banking cause those problems, and government and central banks are not going to solve them. The more government we have, if we try to socialize the economy and turn it into some kind of socialist paradise that only exists in fantasy land, we're going to take a bad situation and make it much, much worse.
You know who controls the government just as well as I do. Blaming the government just lets the people who are pulling the puppet strings off of the criticism they deserve.
Okay, gentlemen, I have to jump in here.
I'm putting the criticism where it deserves.
I want to thank my guests in Westport and in New York, and I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.